Alright, this is going to be a short little video. I totally forgot to test the ability to return data from our component interfaces. In addition, I also will want to go ahead and put some additional logic into our mapped method class that allows it to identify if the method it's mapped returns void, returns an RPC response without a result, or returns an RPC response with a result, and I want to be able to extract those results. So I want to keep this video fairly short here. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into testing the ability of getting return types. So I'm going to jump into my component map tests. And what I want to do here is I want to go ahead and introduce another interface and another component. Of course, I'm not going to apply the test auto map assembly attribute to it, obviously, because that would break a test there later down the road. So I'm going to say iTest component 7. And iTest component 7 is going to have an iRPC response of response no result. Then I'm going to have an iRPC response of int response with result. Now you'll notice immediately that this particular interface has not been written yet. We haven't actually written the iRPC response of type interface yet, and we'll go ahead and do that shortly, though I do want to go ahead and build up my test first. So then what we're going to need to do is going to need to have a class, two classes, one that implements iRPC response and one that implements iRPC response event, so that by having those two interfaces, we will be able to, or those two classes that implement those interfaces will be able to test things properly. So I'm going to say class test RPC response, and it's going to implement iRPC response. And then we're going to have test RPC response, and let's just do of t, iRPC response of t, and then we're just going to leave them like that. Now, when we actually go ahead and fill in our iRPC response interface with members, which we haven't done yet, we're not going to do here for a little bit. But once we actually go ahead and write out our iRPC response interfaces, we will have to go back and fix this test so these two classes implement the appropriate members. But for now, we're just going to leave it like this so I can get the test going. So now that I've done that, I will need to go ahead and write a class that implements this iTest component 7. So I'm going to say test component 7, and I'm going to have it implement iTest component 7. And of course, to implement this this class, I'm going to have to say public iRPC response no result for the first method, and then public iRPC response of int response with result. Now, what these two methods are going to do is I'm going to have two public properties on iTest or test component 7. I'm going to have a public property of iRPC response response 1. It'll be public get and public set, and then I'll have a public iRPC response of int response 2. Now the reason I'm doing that is because these methods will simply return response 1 and response 2 like so. And this way we can go ahead and write a unit test, we can instantiate this component, we can set the responses to what we want them to be, we can invoke their methods, and then we can check to see if the return value actually got threaded back through. So I know this test might seem a little silly to you guys because, well, you'd be saying, oh, well, of course it's going to work. But we haven't actually written any code that does ensure it's going to work yet. So we want to make sure that we do that. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write the actual test for this logic. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down now. And we are going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. Actually, we can go ahead and scroll to... how about this one right here? This can invoke void method 2 params on component, because it's kind of closely related to what we're about to do. So I'm just going to do that. So I'm going to say test public void return values do get passed back from mapped method. Now the first thing we have to do is we have to instantiate our map, so we'll go ahead and do that. We're not going to reserve any component IDs. And then I'm going to say var component equals map.map component. I'm going to pass in type of iTest component 6. Or did I do 7? I think I did 7. Yes, I did do 7. Derp to derp. 7. And then I'm going to say component, whoops, I have to pass an ID as well. I'll just do an ID of 0. And I'll say component map method, passing in type of iTest component 7 dot get method. And then I have to refresh my memory on what methods we have. We have response no results. So this test is going to test response no result. It's not going to test the other one. We'll run another test for that. Now I need to instantiate the object. So I'm going to say var object equals new test component 7. And then I'm going to say object dot response 1 equals new test RPC response, and then object dot response 2 equals new test RPC response of type integer. Now I'm going to actually do, now that I've arranged everything, I need to do the actual acting. So I'm going to go ahead and say map dot methods 0 and 0 dot invoke on object, passing in a new empty object array, and now I have to assert, or sorry, I'll say var result equals that. And now I'm going to say result should be, or should be, there should be a same as, which asserts that they're the same reference, object dot response 1. So we're asserting that it's the same object as response 1. So we won't be able to run this test yet because our code won't compile, but yeah, that should be fine. So then we'll do another test. Return value with result do get passed back from mapped method. Terrible grammar, but it'll do. Map equals new component map. We're going to say var component equals map.map component, type of iTest component 7, ID of 0. We could also copy and paste, but I try to avoid copying and pasting too much in these videos because it typically will go ahead and result in me jumping around a whole lot, which I'm actually about to do because I totally forgot what the other method was called. So if I jump back into iTest component 7, it's response with result is what that's called. So I'll go ahead and get component, or sorry, get method response with result, and I'll map that to an ID of 0. Now I need my object, so I'll do object equals new test component 7. And just like up here, I could also use the object initialization syntax to perform the exact same behavior. Looks like I don't have ReSharper set up the way I want it to either, but whatever. Okay, so then we'll go ahead and basically do the exact same thing. Again, I really should have copied and pasted. I'm sorry. New test RPC response 2 equals new test RPC response of type integer, and then we're going to say var result equals map dot methods at 0, 0 invoke on object, passing in no parameters. And then I'm going to say result should be same as object.response2. All right, so that's all we need to do there. So the last thing that we need to do is actually get this code to compile. And the only thing that's preventing us from compiling these tests is that we haven't yet written the IRPC response of type yet. So just like we talked about in the overview video, the IRPC response of type allows us to return data back in addition to just the things like operation errors and whether or not the operation succeeded. So I'm going to jump into the MMO base project, and I'm going to create a new interface. And the way that I'm going to create this interface is you'll notice that IRPC response and IRPC responsive type actually share the exact same name. The difference is in what generic parameters that they have. In the case of IRPC response, it's none. In the case of IRPC responsive type, it's 1. And fortunately, C# will allow us to write 2 types with the same name as long as their generic types differ, or the amount of generic parameters that they take differ. So to actually write this, I have a particular convention that I do. If I have a generic type that shares a name with a non-generic type, I will name it IRPC response, and then I'll just do a weird little tick up there. I could also do tick 1 as well to indicate that this is a 1 parameter or a type with 1 generic parameter. But when I hit enter, it'll name the file name correctly, but ReSharper will decide to go ahead and insert tick 1 up there at the top. So I'm just going to remove that bit, and then I'm going to say t result. I'm also going to make sure that this inherits from IRPC response because they're going to need to in order to work with the framework. But you'll notice now on the right-hand side that we have the IRPC response, and then we have the IRPC response tick 1. So again, this allows us to have these in two different files that are named essentially the same thing, but they differ in how many generic parameters that they take in. Anyway, if I hit F6, we should get a compile. We do. So now I can jump all the way back to my tests, and I'm just going to go ahead and run this entire fixture. And I see that everything passes. I want to also make sure that indeed return values do get passed back. These both work fine. Okay, the next thing I want to go ahead and do is I want the mapped methods to indicate very easily in the form of an enumeration what kind of return types particular methods may have. For example, I wanted to say, okay, I return void, or I return a response, or I return a response with a result. Now you might be saying, well, why can't you just check the method info on that every time you need to know that? And the answer to that is the code to determine if a thing is a void RPC response or RPC response with result is actually a little less trivial than you might expect. In addition, I also want to extract out the particular result type from a method that returns an IRPC response with result. And what I mean by that is I want to be able to know if a particular method returns an int, for example. So I need to be able to extract with only the knowledge of this method info. I need to be able to extract that integer out of it to know what type that method returns. And that's also a non-trivial thing to do if you're not familiar with the generic reflection API. But, well, I guess we'll go over it. So I'm not going to write tests first in this case, and the reason for that is that I'm going to be introducing an enum. And I want, when I write the test, for this enum to be available so that I don't have any spelling mistakes or whatever, so I get auto-completion. So we're going to write the code first for this, then we'll write tests for it, and there are going to be 3 test cases we're going to add: a void method, an IRPC response method, and an IRPC response with result method. So jumping back into our infrastructure namespace, I'm going to introduce a new enumeration, and I'm going to call this mapped method return type. Hit enter. Now the mapped method return type can be void, response, or response with result. Those are going to be the 3 things that a method can return. If it's anything other than these 3 return value or these 3 return types, I want to throw an exception indicating that this method can't be mapped. Again, this is really important for this RPC framework to work properly, is that we definitely do want to enforce a very specific kind of return types for things. And the reason we need to do that is not on the server side. Now the server side could return whatever it wants. It's for the client side. Because I'm using interfaces to express the RPC framework, the clients will need a special type to be able to latch onto to provide callbacks for when a thing is returned or not. So that's why we need the IRPC response, and that's why any other return type that isn't void or an IRPC response should be invalid. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and jump into our mapped method. Now our mapped method, we're going to add 2 new members to them. I'm going to say public mapped method return type, and I'm just going to call this return type, which get private set. Then I'm going to say public type result, or how about response result type? How about response type or result type? Yeah, result type is good. So anyway, again, what we're looking at here is this int. In the case of this method being mapped, this response with result, that's an IRPC event, I want this result type property to be filled with reference to int. We need that information because we need to be able to serialize it and deserialize it to send it from the server back to the client. So we definitely need that information. So we're going to have to go ahead and get that all established. Okay, so what I'm going to do is up here, before we even worry about compiling the method invoker, I'm going to go ahead and add the logic for this. And I will go ahead and throw an exception if the return type is invalid. And I know it's considered to be bad practice to throw exceptions within constructors, but in this case it'll be innocuous, so I'll go ahead and do it. Just a heads up for anybody who's like, oh, he's throwing an exception in the constructor. Well, yeah, I know it's not the best thing to do, but in this case it's not going to cause any issues with partially created class hierarchies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if method info dot return type equals type of void, then return type equals void. So that is pretty straightforward. Next, else if method info dot return type equals type of IRPC response, then return type equals response. So that's also pretty straightforward. But things get a little tricky when we have to worry about the IRPC responsive type. And the reason for that is, first of all, we need to know if the return type is a generic type, and if its generic type definition equals the open form of an IRPC response. So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to go ahead and write out the code first, and then I'll explain it bit by bit. I'm going to say else if method info dot return type dot is generic type and method info return type dot get generic type definition equals type of IRPC response empty. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, what we're saying is the return type of this method a generic type, meaning it is a type that has a generic argument supplied to it. For example, well, this is a delegate, so it doesn't count. IEnumerable or list of T, for example, would be a generic type because it is a list of a particular type, and that argument has been specified. So we first need to establish if it's a generic type at all. Then we need to get the open form of the generic type itself by invoking get generic type definition. You might be wondering what an open form means. Well, look right here. This is a little bit of interesting syntax that I doubt many people have ran into before. What makes it interesting is you'll notice that we are statically referencing IRPC response, but we're providing no generic arguments to it. In fact, this is the only way or time that you will see a generic type without generic parameters passed into it, or generic arguments passed into it, that won't result in a compiler error. The only way to statically reference the open form of a generic type is within the type of operator. So the type of operator is saying, get me the generic type definition of IRPC response without a actual type parameter added to it yet. So basically, if we return IRPC response of string, right? This is a generic type, and this has a generic type definition of IRPC response of nothing. So this is a generic type right here. Then when I invoke get generic type definition, it'll return the thing that it is with its generic parameter stripped away. And that's how we'll know if something is an IRPC response of something. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can set our enum, so I can say return type equals response with result, but I can also extract the generic type parameter by saying return type equals method info dot return type dot get generic arguments open square bracket 0. So the get generic arguments oh, derp to derp, I meant result type. I have return type and result type. I don't really like those names, but I think they'll just have to do. Okay, so our result type equals method info dot return type dot get generic type argument or generic arguments. So, like for example, if we're starting with IRPC response of string, his generic arguments is this list right here. In this case, there's only one item in the list, and because there's only one item, we access it with the 0th index. And that'll return that information. Finally, I want to say else, throw new argument exception, passing in method must return void IRPC response or IRPC response of T. And then I'm going to pass in method info as the argument name. Alrighty. Let's go ahead and exit full screen and see if we broke anything. That's the first question I want to ask. Did we break any of our existing tests by doing this? It looks like we fortunately did not. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here to our component map tests, and I'm going to test these. I'm just going to hijack iTest component 7 for these 3 tests I'm about to write, and I'll add a void method. So I'll say no response for the void method. So this will allow us to test these 3 different methods and ensure that our code that we just added works. You'll also notice that we now have, we have an error on our class because we also have to do public void no response. That, derp to derp. There we go. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and jump all the way to the bottom. And I'm going to say, I am going to go ahead and copy and paste this test 3 times, by the way, once I get the basic structure set up for it. I'm going to say public void map method identifies void return type. So I'm going to say var map equals new component map, var component equals map.map component, type of iTest component 7, ID of 0, component map method, type of iTest component 7 dot get method, passing in something. Split screen to the rescue here. Keep on forgetting these method names. We have no response, and I'm going to have this be at the 0th index there. I'm also going to just go ahead and map all 3 of these methods. iTest component 7 get method, and then we'll do response no result with an ID of 1 in this case. And then component map method type of iTest component 7 dot get method response with result, passing in an ID of 2. Okay, so this is going to be the identifies void return type. So we've already arranged and acted actually. So now I'm going to say component dot methods at 0 for the component ID and whoops, not component.methods. Actually, I can do component.methods. I'll just do map.methods instead. 0 for the component ID, 0 for the method ID. His return type should be mapped method return type dot void, and his result type should be null. Actually, I wonder if there's a should dot be null. There we go. Okay, so we're going to copy and paste this test. So I'm just going to copy and paste. Then I'm going to say change the name. Map method identifies IRPC response return type. In this case, I'm going to say map method 0, 1. The return type should be response, and its result type should be null. Then I'm going to do this test one more time, and I'm going to say IRPC response with result. And then I'm going to invoke method with the ID of 2, and his return type should be response with result, and his result type should be type of int. All right, let's go ahead and run all of our tests. And we seem to have gotten success, which is always good. Let me make sure identifies, there we go. All right, sweet. So now what we can do with our map method is we can determine its ID, what component it's mapped to, its method info, its return type, its result type, and we can invoke it. And that really is all the information that we are going to need in order to do things like serialization. So yeah, I know I've said this a couple of times, but I really can't think of anything more that I need to add to the component map. I mean, we can load it, we can save it, we can map components, we can auto map assemblies, we can do a whole lot of fun stuff with this already, and it's a pretty cool little method cache that we've built for just mapping different methods to byte IDs, and that's really the purpose of it. I did do some performance tests actually, and I found that the dynamic compilation is substantially faster than the method info.invoke by a factor of what was it? It was almost 10. It was almost 10 times faster. It was at least 6 times faster, and then I think it's kind of hovered around 8 or 9, and then sometimes in certain circumstances was 10 times faster. So yeah. Anyway, but again, the method cache isn't the biggest thing that the component map gives us. The biggest thing that the component map gives us is the ability to pass a unique selector for a particular class and a particular method using just 2 bytes of information, which allows us to create a very powerful RPC system without expending all the bytes that we have. And we support also our reserved IDs as well, which is important for things that we might want to, more performance critical things that we might want to write manually ourselves. Anyway, I think that just about wraps this video up, and we'll see you guys in the next one.